Well, good morning. Hey, if you have a Bible, you can join me in Psalm 18 this morning. If you are new to Living Hope or joining us online for the first time, welcome. We are glad you're here. My name is Derek. I'm one of the pastors here, and I get to oversee and lead our community groups. So last week, if you weren't here, Gib finished up our kind of start of year series as he walked us through over 4 weeks, just everyday faithfulness. What does it look like to follow Christ in the day-to-day of life? And he gave us 4 specific things that he hoped that we would do throughout this year as we think about, as a church, what does it look like for us to practice everyday faithfulness? And so if you don't remember, it was show up, stand out, stick with it, and stay focused. Those are the 4 kind of big ideas that he hoped to see us live out as a church. And so as we begin to transition more into this year, today what I thought we would do is we would spend some time reflecting on the God who actually calls us and enables us to carry out this everyday faithfulness. And we're going to do that by looking at Psalm 18. It's a psalm that's written by David, and actually it is almost word for word found in 2 Samuel 22. And what we know about this psalm is that David is writing it near the end of his life, and he is reflecting back on just the way that God has worked in his life. The way from the very beginning he was anointed king, he was delivered from Saul, and the ways that Saul sought him, all the enemies that he had to face, the battles that he had to fight, and he's reflecting back on all that God has done and all that God has been for him. And really what ends up happening is it just turns into a psalm of praise from David. This is one of the longest psalms that we get. It's 50 verses. We're only going to look at the first 19 of them today. So don't worry, we're not going to be here for an hour and a half. We're just going the first 19 verses of Psalm 18. Here's what he says. I love you, Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God, my rock where I seek refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I called to the Lord who is worthy of praise, and I was saved from my enemies. The ropes of death were wrapped around me. The torrents of destruction terrified me. The ropes of Sheol entangled me. The snares of death confronted me. I called to the Lord in my distress. I cried to my God for help. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry to him reached his ears. Then the earth shook and quaked. The foundations of the mountains trembled. They shook because he burned with anger. Smoke rose from his nostrils, and consuming fire came from his mouth. Coals were set ablaze by it. He bent the heavens and came down, total darkness beneath his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew, soaring on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his hiding place, dark storm clouds his canopy around him. From the radiance of his presence, his clouds swept onward with hail and blazing coals. The Lord thundered from heaven. The Most High made his voice heard. He shot his arrows and scattered them. He hurled lightning bolts and routed them. The depths of the sea became visible. The foundations of the world were exposed. At your rebuke, Lord, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils. He reached down from on high and took hold of me. He pulled me out of deep water. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too strong for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out to a spacious place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. This is the word of the Lord. I don't know if it's true in your family, but in my family, when we all get together, we tend to share some of the same stories from our past. Right? You just have some of those stories that come up over and over again. And I don't know if it's true of yours, but this is what happens. No matter the topics that come up, ideas come up, and right, there's just these kind of shared experiences that we've had that tend to surface again and again. One of those experiences, actually, that involved me that I don't remember, but is talked about over and over again, happened when I was 2 years old. As a family, almost every summer, we used to travel down to Florida, and I had an aunt that lived down there, and we would go and stay there, and it was great because where she lived was close to the beach, and so we could go and spend time at the beach. It was close to Disney World, so we would go down and spend a day or so at Disney World, all right? And then she had a pool, and so we got to just spend time swimming in the pool if we weren't going to either of those places. Well, there was one summer where we were there. Again, I was 2 years old, and I have two older siblings. My brother's 5 years older, and my sister is 2 years older. So if you're not good at math, they were 7 and 4 at this time and when this happened. And so we're down there, and the three of us go and tell my mom, hey, we want to go out to the pool and go swim. And so my mom said, that's fine, but you have to wait for me to get in. I'm going to go change, and then I'll come out there. So remember, I don't know any of this other than I've heard the story. We don't exactly know what ended up happening. I just know that a few minutes later, three of us come back in, all soaking wet. And my brother and sister, and I don't know who it was that said it, but in their 7 or 4 year old way said, Derek drowned, but we saved him. And so what we know happened at this point is somehow I fell into the deep end of the pool, didn't know how to swim, and so my brother jumped into the pool and pushed me out while my sister stood on the side and grabbed hold of my arms and pulled me so that I wouldn't drown and die. So this story comes up over and over again, right? It's been one that's told often, and when it comes up, my brother and sister always like to remind me that if it wasn't for them, that I wouldn't be here today. All right? But it's a good thing for us to rehearse these kinds of stories, for these things to come up again and again, right? And one of the things that I like about this story that it reminds me of often is that when you aren't capable of saving yourself, you need someone who is capable to show up and to pull you out. Right? Now, I would probably contend that the reason I was drowning is because someone pushed me into the water, right? But at least they got me out, because I wasn't capable of saving myself. And when you're not capable of saving yourself, you need someone who is capable to show up and to pull you out. And what's happening in this psalm is David is reflecting back on his life. And he's reflecting back on all the times where he wasn't capable. And someone who was showed up and got him through it. And I think what David does as we walk through really just these 19 verses is there are three things that David kind of reflecting on his life brings up about God that I think are helpful for us that we're going to see today as we walk through these 19 verses. The first thing that David shows us is that God is present. He says in verse 1, I love you, Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer, my God, my rock where I seek refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. Those first two verses there, as he just begins to extol who God is, they give more words about God and who he is than any other place in the psalm in such a short amount of time. I mean, he just packs them in over and over. He describes God as strength, rock, fortress, deliverer, refuge, horn of salvation. And so from the jump, David is praising God for the fact that God has always been what David has needed him to be. I think another way that we could see this is that God's presence meets our need. Scholars notice that when you look at all the descriptions of the ways that David talks about God here, often he's referencing just events from his life. Right? When he fled from Saul, and he needed a cave, he needed an actual rock to go and to hide in order to do that. After he has established as king, he needed strongholds to protect his city and his nation. Right? When he would go out to battle, he needed a shield in order to make sure that he could securely make it through the battle. All of these things, he's looking back on his life and he's seeing that this is what God has shown up. And he's reminded God was exactly what he needed in the moment. That the moments of David's life, they didn't escape the notice of God. And that God was present with David and ready to meet his need. And I can't speak on behalf of David, but my guess would be that in those moments, there's a lot of times when David didn't know that God was actually showing up and meeting his need. When he's fleeing from Saul, I bet David didn't think to himself, oh, there's a cave. I bet that cave is going to teach me something about God, so I'm going to go into the cave. And instead, David was fleeing from Saul, and in his panic, he said, there's a place that I can hide, and I'm going to jump into that. And God knew that David would need a place for him to hide. And so he provided a cave, and eventually that cave is going to teach David something about God. And this is the way so often it happens in our lives. At least I know it's happened in my life that way, right? It could be through fellow believers. It could be through circumstances that take place in your life, right? There are lots of different ways that God is going to show up and he's going to be what you needed him to be, even though you didn't know it. You didn't know in the moment, but as you look back through it, you see that he works through people, places, events to demonstrate that his presence is with you, and it's exactly what you need for the moment. And that's why I think you also see here, as David continues to talk about God, that when we need salvation, because that's where David is going, when we need salvation, God's presence is essential. He says there in verse 3, I called to the Lord who is worthy of praise, and I was saved from my enemies. Right? I was saved from my enemies. I had these people surrounding me. And when David describes his enemies or talks about his enemies, right, this isn't a light conflict that he's thinking of. If you keep looking at verses 4 through 6, he says, the ropes of death were wrapped around me. The torrents of destruction terrified me. The ropes of Sheol, right, another way to describe the ropes of hell entangled me. The snares of death confronted me. Right, what David is describing is going down to the brink of death, that his enemies threatened him in such a way that it brought him down to the depths, that his very life was on the line. And again, I believe that David's composing this psalm at the end of his life. And so when he looks back over the span of his life, he isn't just thinking Saul, the Philistines, and the surrounding nations. I think David probably has in mind those enemies of sin that drug him down into the depths. The sin of sexual predation against Bathsheba and then the murder of her husband Uriah that drew him away from God. The depression that he battled and felt so often in his life, like when his infant son is sick and he just can't, he won't eat, he can't get up, he won't do anything because he's begging God, please heal him. And then he has to mourn when God doesn't answer that prayer. And when he writes the Psalms, it says, God, where are you? I feel like I've been searching for you and I don't see you anywhere. I think all of those things are enemies that he is looking back on and saying, this is what's drawing me away from God. Because so often, in fact, I would guess that for most of us in our lives, what we rarely need salvation from is physical. Instead, it's the relational, the emotional, the spiritual battles that we face. And I think David is looking back and seeing both of those things. And when you need that kind of salvation, that relational, that emotional, that spiritual salvation, God's presence is absolutely essential for you. And I have good news. The good news is that God's presence meets that need. Because hundreds of years after David is going to compose this psalm, the one that the psalm is ultimately about, Jesus, he's going to show up. He's going to take on flesh and he's going to come and he's going to dwell. And he's actually going to bring God's presence into this world. And he will go down into the depths of death. He will let the cords of death surround him. And then 3 days later, he's going to rise from the dead, assuring that the presence of God is always going to be with us and assuring that he will lead us out with salvation. Because when you aren't capable of saving yourself, you need someone who is capable to show up. And that's what Jesus did. He showed up to rescue us, just as he did for David. And when he calls to the Lord hears his call because his presence is with us. I love what he says in verse 6. I called to the Lord in my distress. I cried to my God for help. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry to him reached his ears. In other words, where God was, that's where David's words went. That God hears from wherever he is in his temple, in the place of his presence, he hears and then he acts upon David. He doesn't say, sorry, David, I'm busy right now. I'm in the temple doing some stuff. No, through whatever David is experiencing, God is ready to hear. And so for us, through the trials, the temptations, circumstances, the suffering, the joy, it's always been God's plan to be with his people. It's always been God's plan to hear and to respond, and which is why we can bring our own pain, which is why we can gather together as a church and we can confess our sin together. And we can receive the assurance of the pardon that Christ has secured for us. We can know he is present with us. David looks back on his life and he sees God is present, but he doesn't just see that. The beautiful part about this is he sees not only is God present with his people, but God is powerful. In verses 7 through 15, the presence of God in a very real way, he kind of describes it showing up, and it shows up in power. And the way that he describes it are not things that we typically associate with the presence of God. he says that the earth shook and quaked. The foundations of the mountains trembled. They burned with God's anger. Smoke rose from his nostril, and consuming fire came from his mouth. I mean, let's be honest. He describes God like a dragon. Right? These aren't the things that we typically associate when we think of the presence of God with us, but God shows up in his power, and his power is terrifying in its strength. Right? It should cause us in some ways to fear because of the way he is described. Darkness is around him. He's hurling lightning bolts, he says in verse 14. There's thunder that surrounds him, right? The terrifying nature of the strength of God. Right? And this isn't necessarily actually what God did. Instead, it's the way that God manifested himself in David's life, that there is this power that overcame David, and David knew that God had him. And this imagery often shows up in Scripture of God. Right? We don't necessarily always think about this, but this isn't uncommon for God to be described this way. It happens throughout the Psalms. In fact, a lot of this imagery takes the reader back, especially the Israelites, back to the Exodus. When they gather around Mount Sinai and God is initiating the covenant and he's giving them his law. If you've read that and you go back to chapter 19 and 20, there is a darkness that descends and clouds descend and there's thunder and there's lightning and there's fire. And the Israelites say, we aren't going near there. All right, they're sending Moses and they're going, no, you go and then we'll just stand here and you can mediate for us. We're okay with that. Because there is this terrifying nature to the presence of God. And here's the honest truth. We want it that way, ultimately. We want a God who can do as he pleases. We want a God who, when he shows up, it rattles the very foundations of the earth. Because if you have a God like that, nothing can stop him. And while his power might be terrifying in strength, the beautiful thing about his power is that it is also unstoppable in salvation. Remember, David is describing the way that God showed up when he needed saving. When enemies pressed around him and there was nothing that David could do to save himself. When it became very clear to David, I don't have this. I am too weak. I don't have the strength to do this. God thunders onto the scene, and in his power, nothing could stop David's salvation. Because nothing can stand against the power of this God. And the same was true when Christ comes to this earth. Right? Christ comes to the earth, and what does he do? He heals every disease and every sickness. He stands in a boat, and he speaks, and he tells nature, stop. And the winds and the waves, they just obey what he did, what he said. He makes the lame to walk. He makes the blind to see. He makes the deaf to hear. Because he has the power. And here's the thing. All of those people who needed that kind of healing, they couldn't get it themselves. They didn't have the power to take away, to give themselves sight. They didn't have the power to make their legs strong so they could walk. They needed someone who was capable for them to do it for them. And so Jesus showed up. In our life, we can't overcome sin and death. Right? Gibbs says this often, but it's good to be reminded of. Jesus didn't come to make bad people good. He came to make dead people alive. We can't overcome sin and death, and so what Jesus did was he showed up. Right? And the most powerful act of history that's ever been performed on a Sunday morning outside the city of Jerusalem, he shook. That's what it tells us. The earth quaked. He shook the very foundations of the world. And Jesus started breathing again, and his heart started beating again because nothing can overcome the power of God because his salvation is unstoppable. And through his resurrection, what Jesus does is he starts the process of overturning all that sin and death has broken in the world. And that's how we have hope. That's how when the cords of death begin to entangle us, when it feels like in your life that it is overwhelmed and you are drowning, we can look to our Savior who we know has already defeated death because his salvation is unstoppable. No, everything is not perfect right now. We still very much experience the brokenness of the world around us. But we know that one day everything will be set right because nothing can stop the power of our God. His salvation is unstoppable for us. And the final thing I think that David shows us in this psalm, and maybe the most joyful and hopeful for us, is the truth that God is personal. In verses 7 through 15, David is just focusing on God, the power he has and the way he operates and the way he shows up, the way he acted to rescue him. Right? It's all focused on the power and the strength of God. And then you get to verse 16, and it gets very personal for David. He reached down from on high, and he took hold of me. He pulled me out of deep water. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too strong for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out to a spacious place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. In those 4 verses, David mentions himself, me or my, 10 different times. Right? From 7 through 15, all he does is focus on God, focus on God, focus on God. And then in those 4 verses, he's like, here's what he did for me. And every one of those references to himself is in reference to something, some way that God intervenes into his life. He's looking back on his life and he's reminded God is personal. And the way that David describes this rescue, as I was thinking about this, it brought 2 things to mind. The first thing I think it shows us is that God's mercy is meant just for you. His mercy is meant just for you. If you think through just the different scenarios that David runs through in verses 16 through 19, he says that I was way down because he reached up from on high and took hold of me. Right? So when David was steady and wavering, God's right there. He has a hold of him. He pulls him out of deep water. When David felt like he was drowning, God made sure he got up for air. When he was surrounded by powerful enemies, those who hated me, the people who were too strong for me, God was there. When David was too weak, when David needed strength from somewhere else, God was there. When the world, it felt like, was crashing around him, in the day of his calamity, right, the Lord was his support. I mean, that's just different ways that God is showing up and meeting his need, right? Because as I told you, the presence of God meets our need. But what David is describing, it's not just a general, he met my need. We can think that, right? God meets our needs. Yeah, he meets all, generally, like for all of us, he meets our needs, yes. But no, his mercy shows up in specific ways for each one of us. And that's the kind of mercy that David is describing. I believe I've referred to this before, but I've always been fascinated by Lamentations 3, verses 22 through 23. In there, he says, because of the Lord's faithful love, we do not perish. His mercies never end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And what fascinates me about that is it's a little bit perplexing that mercies that never end have to be new every morning. If they never come to an end, why do they need to be new? Well, I believe the answer to that question, and we can see it even in what David shows us here, is that because each day brings new issues with it. And every morning when you wake up, his mercy is meant just for you and just for everything that he knows you're going to face in that day. And so the mercy he has for you, because your day is going to be different than my day, the mercy he has for you is different than the mercy he's going to provide for me. And the mercy he provides for someone else is going to be different than the mercy that he provides for someone else, because every single day it brings new issues. Some days you feel like you're drowning. Some days your enemies are surrounding you. Some days everything feels great, but his mercy is meant just for you. His mercy is there every morning, ready for every person, every place, every situation that you're going to face. And it's going to be there all day long. It never comes to an end. And so, if you feel unsteady and wavering, right, God is like a good parent who's teaching their child to walk, holding onto their hand, and when they stumble and fall, God doesn't let them fall. Right? You don't let them fall down. You hold on to them, you pick them back up, and you set them back on their way. Right? If you feel like right now you're drowning, and everything just seems too overwhelming, God's mercy, it's the air that you need. When you are weak, He is strong. If you feel like the world is crashing down around you, he is the support that you can lean on. If you need rescue, he can do it. Because his mercy is meant just for you. And the last thing that David tells us, maybe the thing that maybe delighted me the most when I read this, is what he says there at the very end of verse 19, right? His mercy is meant just for you because he delights in you. This powerful, present God delights in you. David says, he rescued me because he delights in me. He didn't rescue David because he deserved it. He didn't rescue David because David performed exactly the right way. He rescued him because he delighted in him. Now we stopped at verse 19, and again, this psalm continues on through verse 50. But if you start reading, and I can't ignore verses 20 through 24, because if you go back and read this psalm, all of it today, you're going to wonder what happened in verse 20 and 24, because it seems like in verses 20 and 24, David begins to say, I did these righteous things, and so God did what he was supposed to for me. It almost feels like he says, I had clean hands, I never went the way of the wicked, and God sustained me and did all of these things for me. And it seems a very stark contrast to what he says in 16 through 19. And what most everyone agrees as they study this psalm is that David is looking back on his life and he's seeing the unmerited favor of God, how he pulled him out, how he saved him from Saul, set him on the throne, and then throughout the time of David's reign on the throne, he sought to, for the best of his ability, follow after God, and God was faithful to continue to keep him on the throne. But ultimately, what ends up happening is if you look at those verses and you look, he does this according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands, right? I turned away from wickedness. You can't look back on David's life and think he completely has clean hands. Or that he didn't, in some way, shape, or form, go after some wickedness. And so I think ultimately, again, as I said earlier, I think this psalm is ultimately pointing us to the one who would fulfill what David is talking about. It's pointing us to the person who would come and who would do everything that was exactly right. He would keep all of God's commands and all of God's ordinances. He would be blameless. He would always flee from wickedness. He would keep himself from iniquity. He would be the true Lord's anointed. I think what David is doing is he's pointing us to Jesus. It's because Jesus came to rescue us. And he came not because we were good, not because we had earned it, but because we actually couldn't. He came because he delights in us. Because when you're incapable of saving yourself, you need someone who is capable to show up and to pull you out. All those years ago, I don't know ultimately what led to me at 2 years old falling into the deep end of the swimming pool. Here's what I know. The reason my brother and my sister worked together to pull me out was because they loved me. Right? They knew that I wasn't capable of saving myself. So their love motivated them to show up and to pull me out. You and I aren't capable of saving ourselves. And so in his love, because he delights in you, Jesus showed up. And the good news is his delight in you never changes. Amen. It isn't based on your performance this past week. It isn't based on how you're going to do today. It's based on his performance. It's based on his delight in you. And his delight does not change. And so as we think about that everyday faithfulness that we've been talking about, it's good for us to be reminded, and Gib pointed this out, it's good for us to be reminded that our everyday faithfulness doesn't make God delight in us. Instead, God's delight in us makes it possible for us to be faithful every day. And so, God, would you make that happen in our lives? Would you show us more and more of your great love for us? God, we are thankful that you are personal with us, you are present with us, and that you are powerful to save us. Nothing can stop the amazing nature of your salvation. And so would you help us just to recognize that, to see that? God, for those who are here and have never experienced your salvation, would you, by your Spirit, work in their heart today to bring it about? And God, would you help us to live by it each day? For your glory and our joy in you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.